And we are live with Naomi Shelton from Ward 6 in Washington, D.C., also works with the KIPP Foundation as a community engagement director, is also a DCPS SB Charter School Board member. And she is proud to say that she is HBCU educated and UNCF K-12 alum. She's also Spike's human. So Spike apparently is her dog child. Yeah. Naomi, welcome.
Thank you, Chris. It's good to be back.
I love having people return because it helps us deepen our conversations over time.
Right.
So today I wanted to talk a little bit about Washington, D.C. Not a little bit. I want to talk directly about Washington, D.C., specifically because it's one of the cities I'm keeping tabs on for my organization, Brightbeam. So in January, Brightbeam published a report called The Shame of Progressive Cities. The report was meant to highlight in detail the fact of which we have a silent problem, a problem that goes unnoticed, which is in very progressive, wealthy cities with lots of college-educated people, cities that have a lot going for them in terms of art and culture and music and food, and foodies can revel in it and can just what the mayors of those cities would call world-class cities in the United States. There's a problem. That problem is in each one of them, Black and brown children are falling behind or at the wrong end of a gap in outcomes. And it's a peculiar gap that we should be curious about when you think that the municipal governments of these cities are very progressive and liberal, and they are and they're not necessarily broke. These cities are not necessarily broke, right? It's not like we're talking about Mobile, Alabama. No. We're talking about Seattle and San Francisco. And of those progressive cities, DC is the number 2 most progressive city in the United States, with some really not fabulous outcomes for Black students, Black and brown students. So thus our conversation today to talk about DC. First, on an upside in DC, let's just talk about the fact that you have some new Black woman leadership in key positions within Washington, D.C. What's that?
So we have just completed and over the summer named the leader or executive director of the DC Public Charter School Board. So Scott Pearson, who was our former ED, was in that position for about 8 years. So some significant strides in terms of policies, procedures, protocol that have taken place in the last 8 years for the charter board were put in place by Scott. He announced his retirement late last year, or mid-year last year, with his tenure ending over the summer. And we've now named Dr. Michelle WalkerDavis. She is not new to DC. She formerly worked for Williams, and she's been in Minnesota for the last several years leading Generation Next. And we're super excited to have her on board. We went through a really robust community engagement to really engage with stakeholders. So parents, education leaders, elected officials. We work directly with the traditional school board, and had people of color, so several BIPOC leaders that were in our finalist list, and excited to have her join the team. We actually have our retreat this week, so we'll get to spend some more time with her. And then
before we move on, let me just say, Michelle, you mentioned Michelle Walker was here in the Twin Cities.
Yes,
she was, and I've had a few opportunities to work with Michelle over the time that she's been here in Minnesota. She was with the St. Paul public school system And if people don't know from a distance, as we're talking about progressive cities and the way things roll in politics in progressive cities, St. Paul Public Schools is that's the system that ousted Valeria Silva, which was their superintendent, because they didn't like her equity plan. And by saying they didn't like her equity plan, they didn't like that she was focusing on equity at all. She would routinely show people, the public, the data that basically said that Black students coming from households with over $200,000 were doing worse in that school system than white kids that were in poverty. And she would trot that out each time and says, so we have to stop saying the problem is poverty, because the problem, there's clearly some racial problems here. And they paid her over $700,000 to leave. That's how bad they wanted to get out. The teachers union ran a slate of school board candidates, and I know this isn't how people of color get fired, right? Like fire me. This is what I'm saying. Like fire me. But the teachers union so hated her because the white teachers of the district hated her because she was doing things like holding them accountable for outcomes and making them rethink the way that they deliver education. The union ran a slate of school board candidates who won, and they immediately set about the work of getting her out of the district. That was the reason they ran. And this is a story about how powerful teachers unions are. They can override democracy. They don't like what's going on in a district, they can take you out. So anyways, they paid her over $700,000 to leave. Michelle Walker worked for the district at the time, and I thought she was starting to do some really important work there. And she moved on from there to another organization called Generation Next here locally. This is a lot of background, but the only reason I'm giving it is because these progressive cities chew up and spit out people of color who have to end up going somewhere else to get their work done, right? And no one will talk about the fact that Minnesota, being the Twin Cities, is on that list of most progressive cities. And there's two routes for a person of color in leadership position here. You either do what you're told and go with the program, or you update your resume and you leave Minnesota. So congratulations, DC. Y'all done got one of your native daughters back again because Minnesota done spit her out. And she's great. She's amazing.
She was there for a little while, though.
She actually did a long tour of duty in this liberal bullshit. She did this shit for too long. But congratulations, DC. Y'all got yourself a really good candidate. We love to send some of our best people of color to other places to do great work. Anyways, let's move on to your next person here.
All right. So Shannon Hodges is the new executive director to the newly aligned DC Charter School Alliance. She is a former co-founder of Kingsman Academy Public Charter School. And I don't know if she was the founder. I shouldn't say that. I know that she was the executive director, but I'm pretty sure that she was also a co-founder. I actually met her for the very first time, having to confirm diplomas for their high school. And so have always been really interested in her work, really excited to see what the Alliance is able to do in terms of some advocacy for charter schools here in the district. So really, really glad to see that we are leaning towards Black female leadership, but also very nervous being in a progressive liberal city, because I also see those as two different things, and how that shows up in terms of some of the less than desirable ways that people interact with you because they are Black women. So.
When you say that there are two different things, are you talking about liberal and progressive?
Yes.
What do you mean by that?
So liberal, I would say people who are liberal tend to fall, either middle to left of center when it comes to Democratic in terms of the party alignment, and progressive being more left. And very, very different and radical in the ways that they show up.
So is this the difference between Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders?
Yes. Yeah. That would be a great example.
And where do you think DC is more in?
Oh, I always say that there's a tale of two cities in DC. I could even say there are three. I think that there's a strong a liberal stronghold here in terms of like Washington, D.C., separate from Capitol Hill, all of the things in terms of residents. But there's this wave of progressive thought that in a lot of cases, some of the things I do see as issues that we should be considering for the folks that are more conservative in their democratic views. But there are also just some tactics that come along with that I'm a forest for the trees type of person, and that doesn't always show up. And I can give an example of like what you just named, the Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders thing. Came across some information, and I'm not saying that I have had the opportunity to like dig to it and really define it for myself and do the research, but like what's happening now with the U.S. Postal Service, there was actually an opportunity for then President Obama to name people to the Board of Governors for the United States Postal Service. And who blocked it? Bernie Sanders. And so now trying to manage through and how we're seeing like the long-term effects of being able to like stack your deck and have a long-term vision. That's always been an issue for the Democratic Party. We do love to go high. But in going very radical and like stalling on that process allowed Trump to name majority of the people that are on the board. And who blocked it? And so that, that's a thing. And so how do you continue to say that you're progressive when your actions don't really lead to the outcomes that some of the strategic ways that people who are more conservative in their liberal ideas, how do you really balance that?
Do you think that shows up in education politics? And when I say not national, because I can think of ways that shows up in the national politics, but does that bleed down to local politics, for instance, in DC?
Yes and no. So, there's a stronghold, like I said.
See, I just want to start by saying that is a very DC political answer. Well, yes and no.
And no. So I'll say this. Yes, it shows up, and it shows up all the time. It shows up, it's really it's almost like a cult culture that you don't really know it unless you are a part of that or in those discussions. And then by the time they bubble up to the larger community, it's either too late or people have already made their determinations and have like put stakes in the ground. And so, I was raised by a PR professional, so I do political answers most of the time, not all the time. So yes, there are things that people have locked into in terms of heard from national discussions about education that they don't show up the same way here. So that tension often causes harm because there's contextual, I love color and context. If I were to start a blog, I'd probably call it that. But there are things that happen or that have happened that have gotten us to where we are. And those actions are kind of being, I won't say completely kneecapped, but chipped away by people who don't understand how it is that we got to where we are and where the long-term vision is for that. I think one of the biggest things I would say is a lot of the teachers union rhetoric has come into play. And some of that rhetoric is over 10 years old, and we've made complete strides from 10 years ago to now. So yeah, it shows up and it's painful. And it's frustrating, especially when you know what has happened.
When you have the background.
Yeah.
When you think of the background. And DC has actually got an interesting background, a mixed bag in ways. So you have, it's a place where Black education ruled the roost at one point. It was like a golden city for Black education, Black controlled, Black administrated, Black delivered education specifically for children that the rest of the nation thought that they couldn't educate. It also went through a dark era where it seems like y'all were changing chancellors every 3 days.
Right.
maybe a little
And
longer. I think.
are you talking about most recently or prior?
No, this was prior to Michelle Rhee. It seems
Yeah.
like there was a stretch of damn near a chancellor a year.
Mm-hmm.
I might be exaggerating, but not by much.
Not by much. And as reform has, during that time period, as reform had its waves, you would see superintendents bounce from city to city because they were familiar with the work in terms of running an urban school district. But then as the wave of reform moved forward, they, had to be moved again. And so it's been really interesting to see. One of the things that has always frustrated me when we talk about that here in DC is that, yes, most of our superintendents, I think all of our superintendents, have been of color, Black, if not specifically.
Yeah,
I should
have you
know
guys
this.
ever had a white chancellor?
I don't know. We definitely have never had a white chancellor.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm trying to think of superintendents because I did spend a portion of my education in Prince George's County. But to my knowledge, all of our, and our school board has always been reflective of the city.
Yeah. So this is, Naomi, this is where it gets tough, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we just talked about the leadership of DC has been Black for a very long time.
Yeah.
During Michelle Rhee's time, the teachers union president was Black.
Yep.
Before her, the chancellors had been Black. They have a very Black teacher force, workforce. And it was one of America's chocolate cities, right?
Yep, the latte city now.
The latte city now. Well, y'all verging on like something. It's just cinnamon city, I guess.
Right.
But I say all this to say that I want to add this to the stream here. This is our Bright Beam report on Washington, D.C. And it's not a report on D.C. This is what I mentioned earlier, our progressive cities report, which is basically looking at progressive cities. This is the fact sheet on Washington, D.C. And, looking at the average math and reading achievement gaps between D.C. and other progressive cities and the nation's conservative cities, top conservative cities, you can see here that the gap between Black and white, for instance, is 62 percentage points in DC. It's 41 in other progressive cities, and it's only 26 in conservative cities. The Latino white gap is even smaller in conservative cities. And in Black reading and math, this is the same. So when you put this up, people, oftentimes don't want to talk necessarily about test scores because they think that that's all this is. So I just want to say, for the people who are looking at this and saying, well, test scores don't tell us everything, and there's other things going on or whatnot. Help me understand what the other things going on, because I do want to say a 62-point gap does tell me something, right? I don't know about anybody else, but it tells me it doesn't say this.
I can't see the bottom of that chart. What are the? There we go. Thank you.
I mean, the green is DC.
Yeah.
The more kind of tealish, seafoamish green
is progressive.
Is progressive districts, not aligned with DC, and then the reddish, orangish is conservative cities.
Right.
Now, the thing, first of all, let's just start here. The thing that got people most mad, especially on the left side of the world, the leftist, my good friends who are progressives they hated the fact that we compared them to conservative cities.
Right.
And in the beginning, we were just comparing big cities and the top ones, and we came across something from MIT that rated them on how progressive or conservative they were, and we thought that would be an interesting way to run the data. So, anyways, help me understand these numbers in a city that's got so much going for it.
We were talking about poverty before, so I think that has always played some level of a role in what is happening in terms of the disparities in terms of resources that are going to particular schools. And even say there was a time of I don't want to call it brain drain, but there was a time where we just were not pouring into I think it's called the belief gap. There was a there was a period of time, an extended period of time, mix in just the drug crisis. You mix in a lot of different factors, and that plays into how people perceive the perceptions of what was possible for Black students here. And that was one of the things that Mayor Adrian Fenty stood on in terms of what he wanted to shift in what was happening, because we had Black leadership. We, like you said, we have a majority Black teaching force. But we all know that, unfortunately, too many of us really and truly don't believe that what's possible in terms of what Black students can do and what they can achieve. And I tell this story occasionally when I talk about my time with the Fenty administration, that Michelle Rhee held a press conference at a warehouse here in the city. And in that warehouse were resources and books and all of these things that had never been distributed, specifically east of the river. And what does that mean to just hold on to things because you don't think they're of value to the people that deserve them the most? And I think that has had a long-term and long-standing impact on just how the city has fared and what we believe to be true about Black people.
You know what I couldn't understand in that? I mean, so you have a new chancellor who comes in and says, damn it, look at this warehouse full of resources that are supposed to be out at kids. And we have such a bureaucratic system that we can't get it to the kids, right? She does a series of those type of things and then eventually ends up with a lot of hate on her doorstep.
Yeah, she did.
I mean, I guess I kind of understand the politics or the way that this happens, and all the, she did this way or that way or whatnot. Right. But I still don't understand why people don't like to be told when things are just obviously going wrong for kids in a school district.
I think because there's an idea of, and human nature, right? This isn't about race. This is human nature. How can you tell me that what I've done this entire time, where I've worked super hard and I've done all these things, that they were all wrong? It's almost like when kids go off to college, go to, start their careers, they go to therapy and then they go back to their parents and they're like, these things, were problematic. And the parents are like, wait a minute, last time I checked, you're a thriving adult. What are you talking about? It's about the fact that I used to spank you. And, these things, start to bubble up and people take offense to it. And there were some things that she did in terms of, I hate it. Just in terms of like the public facing persona that was created in terms of like, she had carte blanche. She had the ability to do what was necessary. And it was like thumbing her nose at the community. Between that press conference and there were several council hearings where teachers were protesting. And I just remember there being a hearing where there was a group of teachers with signs spelled incorrectly. And I just remember thinking, okay, now I understand why. Like I get why they shouldn't have those roles. But those are still people that have been working in a system that had allowed those things to continue. And so it was just a perfect storm of political and their perception and personal stuff that all just culminates into people seeing what was working and how things had improved, but not liking the messenger.
That's kind of my problem with some of these stories, is that we get caught in the superfluous questions. Like, I don't like her style. I don't like the way she said X, Y, or Z.
Yeah.
But you have the same level of energy when it comes to, I don't like a racialized gap in academic outcomes because it creates a racialized gap in employment, and then a racialized gap in income, and then a racialized gap in home ownership, and then a racialized gap in wealth. So
and it
keeps bubbling up. So why do I have time to talk about I don't like her style? What she did might be true. It might be true. It might even be true. But she should have said it differently.
Exactly. And that happened more often than not here. And and DC is just really interesting. It's not just familiar from a lot of other urban centers where we have a high concentration of Black people. And the people, have you ever noticed that you don't see, I don't remember growing up seeing a ton of middle class, well, no, I can say middle class, but low income families that were white. I didn't see a high number of those families growing up. So when you're doing, in DC, and Prince George's County has more diversity, but the further you go out, the whiter it becomes, because there's always been this level of Black. Part of it wasn't flight. Part of it was like, we're going into this space in the county because we now have the money to do so. And so then poor white people were pushed further and further away from the city. So the comparisons are also showing up in the fact that we have a large wealth gap. And there aren't a lot of white kids to compare. And somebody did say that in the chat as well.
You have more, though, I think, economic range within the Black population there. So you have more wealthy Black people, more upper middle class, more Black people in Mercedes. Per
That's
capita.
Your thing, Chris. Chris, you love bringing that up.
Because there's a few places in DC and near DC that I think are rare in the time that I've spent there. You have entire communities of Black people who have manicured lawns and decent houses and either a Mercedes or a BMW in the driveway. So when we talk nationally about Black people, we always forgo talking about this group of people like they don't exist.
They exist.
I mean, and in DC and near DC, they exist in bigger numbers than I've seen almost anywhere else.
If I'm not mistaken, Prince George's County has per capita the highest number of, in terms of income. The Black income levels are disproportionately higher than other places in the country.
So you have a disproportionately higher number of African Americans who have something in life. Downtrodden, oh my God, trauma informed, woe is me. I've been marching.
You should have Curtis Valentine on here to talk about.
I need to have Curtis on because Curtis is my dude. He really is.
Yeah, but the disparities in terms of educational outcomes in schools in Prince George's County as well, because the county is fairly large and it is a full swath of low income to high income levels, and the outcomes of educational outcomes just being vastly different.
Naomi,
right
now.
What?
A tough question right now. We're gonna do some tough talk.
Okay.
Right now about
your
Monday.
Okay.
So much of our conversation is about we need to get more Black teachers. We need to get more Black people in the classroom. Oh my God, I can't believe that New Orleans fired its Black teachers, which, by the way, for anybody listening, New Orleans has more Black teachers than you do. So fix your face. I don't care where you are. Like, you can keep running this talking point about how New Orleans got rid of all of its Black teachers. I can guarantee you, besides a few places in the United States, they got more Black teachers than you do. A lot of y'all, I should say, who keep that talking point going. You need to look at home first before you come after another place for its Black teachers, because New Orleans has a majority of Black teachers. But anyways, you mentioned Prince George's County. We talk about DC. There's like Black hegemonic rule. Upper middle class. PG County, like pre-Katrina New Orleans, can't keep itself out of the news for just not great news. Things that people shouldn't be doing, right? With money, with each other, with cameras, what do we do to hold our own accountable on these things?
So that's probably, that question is a tough question, but it's a question that we need to be asking, right? And I think it is a thing of, so Oh, Chris, you gonna have us. This is what happens when Chris and I are together on a regular basis. So this has been great for us to not have to be at conferences and meetings, that we don't go into these like these theoretical, philosophical conversations. So, Chris, you know that I grew up here in DC and now Prince George's County. Um, Part of it, I think, is like we don't have metrics to hold each other accountable towards. And I'm talking about broad stroke. This is more so broad stroke. So we've had this conversation when it comes to Congressional Black Caucus Foundation's annual legislative conference. We do not have something to say annually, this is our agenda, and these are the measures that we're going to hold our elected officials to year after year in terms of like collectively coming up with that platform. And if there, you know, in terms of there is, that it's not something that is broadly and widely known. And so when folks go back home, they're going to do their work, but that work is not always connected. So I think that part of it is, you know, the lack of metrics that we have set, right? But then there's also just a disconnect in terms of, you know, some people have bought into the meritocracy of you have, I don't, or I have and you don't, so that's your fault, not mine, and how that shows up. And so it's scary to think about in terms of when you think of where we were as a community and where we are now, and there not being those points of connection just readily built in for us to collectively do this work and think about if you are at one income level on one end of the spectrum or the other, you know what it is that we are collectively fighting for. And I think that that has played a role in terms of why we are just so far behind in terms of collective action.
You know, I actually I think it's very complicated or complex. I don't know which the right word would be, but it's not, there's no simple story here. But from a distance, watching PG and watching DC from a distance, this is as a person who's not native and indigenous to the area or whatnot. So I have what might be seen as like outsider a view on things. I've heard a mixed bag of things, which you've already mentioned some that, you know, at one point, PG County was seen as the place that had the most number of successful Black people all together, like in the same place. I remember years ago reading a story about how some of those Black folks in PG County didn't want the Black folks from DC coming over the fence to their schools, right? So there was this class issue. There was this issue of us and we're these kind of Negroes and those are those kind of Negroes. And I remember being shocked by that, like, they acting like white parents act when you try and invade their territories or whatnot. And since then, I've learned it's more complicated than that because PG is economically mixed. It's not like it's all wealthy folk. But I still go back to the same question around pre-Katrina. We have had more energy around looking for corruption and holding people accountable, for instance, in New Orleans after Katrina than we ever had before Katrina. Before Katrina, people were catching FBI cases left and right. The district couldn't account for its money ever. People were getting all kinds of weird contracts. There was all kinds of, you know, family members on payroll and all that stuff. And we had no energy for it then.
Right. And one of the things that's interesting about when you have that conversation with people who have longstanding context of New Orleans versus like what the narrative has been post-Katrina, people don't know about all of those issues, right? They don't know about the corruption. You have to be close to folks in Louisiana to really know about it. And so you speak to this all the time, that there are reasons why some of those teachers did not need to be in the teaching force. But if you compare that to DC and to Prince George's County, because there is such a concentration, you know, the conversations people have about, well, when did you have your first Black teacher? And I'm like, early. Like my very first teacher was Black here in DC. And so the idea of what does that accountability look like when the people who are bringing harm to students are Black? And is that the system being racist, or is that something else? And is it, and that's what makes it hard to say, especially when you're measuring against, sometimes there are white people's measuring sticks that we're bringing into this. And it's like, what are the things that need to be brought to the forefront to make sure that we're all thinking about education in a way that is helpful to everyone? Because quickly I can almost hear in the back of my head some people saying, oh, well, these kids are bad and their parents don't care about education. The time I spent at UNCF was really working to combat and to negate that perception by presenting data and research that spoke differently to how people perceive how Black low-income and middle-income parents feel about education. And so when you're trying to juggle all those ideas of, well, Black kids can't learn because that's what tons of white people are saying. Then you have Black people that are saying, oh, because they're not in two-parent households, they can't learn. And we know those things we know that those aren't necessarily true. But how do you stop that rhetoric from chipping away at what's possible?
Yeah, I think with Black middle class and Black upper middle class, the sentiments about Black working class and Black underclass parents it mirrors what the broader population thinks about those folks.
Unfortunately.
So the narratives around Black working class families and mothers and parents and students and underclass students it's a stereotype. It's built on a stereotype. And people of all hues and colors, once they get a little bit of money, are trying to create social distance between their kids and those kids.
Yeah.
Don't talk about that. It's one of the things I was underneath my question. Even when everything is all Black in a city, it doesn't stop Black people of means from still creating white-like enclaves themselves.
And hierarchy, right.
Hierarchy.
And social class and hierarchy, yeah.
Kaya Henderson is one of my favorite people in education, period, ever in the history of education. She's a person that I think actually, to me, is an echo of the Black education legacy. So when I think about people that I researched from a long time ago, like Lucy Craft Laney and Mary McLeod Bethune, and I think about year by year and decade by decade as you get through Marva Collins and others, and we were to ask a question today, who's a modern day person that's an echo of those folks, Kaya would be one of those people. Not everybody shares that opinion, right? And this is my thing around, first of all, the politics. Sometimes it can look like you're in control in education, but what people don't see is all the people that they don't see, like the power people, the money people, the behind the scenes people. What do you think that people don't see when it comes to that in DC?
So I think one of the reasons people have an issue or take issue with Kaya is initially how she came into the space here in DC is that she was number 2 to Michelle Rhee. And so that carries a level of, cartilage. And then as time progressed, there were so many things happening. And I remember a lot of it, but I also remember actively trying to not think about it because when Fenty was not reelected, I ended up going to work for Baltimore public schools, Baltimore city schools, for a brief stint as they were reconfiguring some things in their central office. And so I tuned out a lot of what was happening here in DC on the education front because it was so painful knowing that Michelle had a vision. A lot of that got lost in translation. And so when Kaya was eventually named, when Michelle left, people were excited. And I remember saying to folks that I was still engaged with in the education space, saying, this will be interesting to see how the plan that they had created, that Michelle was the face of, now that there's a Black woman face on that, how people will see that. And there were things that came up in terms of attributing, privatization of public schools and all of the other rhetoric that got attributed to Kaya. And because of particular stances that she took it just didn't fare well for her. So there were things that came up and happened because of, like you said, all the other elements at play, and how that has now just, kind of bubbled into where she is now and how she's going about doing her work.
Not to make the whole DC thing about her, but she had one of the longest tenures as a school district leader in the country, because the average shelf life of a superintendent, for instance, is like 3.5 years. I think it might be getting closer to 4 years. And she did eight or nine years, which is remarkable. It gives you enough time to stick around to see your things that you put into place, whether or not they're bearing fruit.
That's right.
And what happens nationally oftentimes is superintendent comes in, people who have listened to me, you hear my stories over and over again. You've heard this one before. Year one, superintendent comes in with the PowerPoint and says, behold, I have a vision for what we're going to do. We're going to move all the deck chairs. We're going to change the boundaries. We're going to send kids different directions, blah, blah, blah. And in year two, it's like, it's still too soon to tell whether or not the plan is working, but we're still going to do the same stuff. And then year three, it's kind of like, it's been nice knowing you guys. I have updated my resume and now I'm going somewhere else so that I can bring my PowerPoint to their town.
That's right. And I actually have a friend who was a long-term teacher in Prince George's County who had the same situation where they changed their superintendent so often that they never got to see plans all the way through. And she was an elementary school teacher, and she ended up leaving. She, studied education. It wasn't like she went through a training program. She took the traditional route and was a teacher for at least a decade, if not 15 years. And eventually left. She was like, we haven't gotten raises. We have, like my quality of life is impeded by the fact that we can't have and see through a vision.
Well, in some cities, I want to say this to everybody watching, wherever city you're in, some of you need to be careful about becoming a city that isn't worthy of a good superintendent, because I've watched superintendent searches. I've been involved with more than one of them. I know how competitive it is. And sometimes when you have a good candidate, someone who will be good for you, who will take things seriously in terms of academics and systems and know what they're doing, they might not want to come to your city if they look at your board and your board is crazy. If they look at your past superintendent and you treated your last superintendent like trash. Sometimes, like a superintendent is like dating. You look at the way a dude treats his mama and you if it ain't good, you might not want to go there. Well, in this situation with cities, they look at how you treated their previous superintendents. And if you let parents run them out of town for something stupid, or funders run them out of town for something stupid, you can end up being a market where only the D players want to come. Right. So anyways,
who loses, right? We don't talk about, and I guess that goes back to the point we made earlier about the long game and what does it mean in terms of being able to see the forest for the trees. Like, you have to think about, what does it mean to like stick on one issue versus being able to, and like right now, political discussions are really rooted in, if you are looking at this on a single issue, you're happy with, particular candidates. But if we get bent out of shape, related to one or two issues when it comes to a larger vision for what we want to see in education, we lose. And not only the adults lose, the children, and like generationally, what does that mean? When you have another cohort of kids who come out and just don't have what they need to have to be prepared, which then perpetuates what you were going into around having a pipeline of teachers, people that are committed to being able to really pour into the next generation.
Thing that Kaya did there that I thought was really smart was that she focused a lot on systems, teaching and learning, the mechanics of delivering good education. And she also did a good job of navigating the politics, where you had people on one side who were money people who wanted to divest from her and wanted to divest out of the district because she wasn't doing the stuff they wanted her to do, like Michelle did. And on the other hand, you had Black folks and white progressives who were coming at her from the left saying, she was privatizing and whatnot. So the way that I know that you're doing a good job oftentimes in the city is when you piss everybody off, when everybody gets mad, and when everybody's mad, but you're focusing on the systems, the things that will outlive you, the things that matter, tells me you're masterful, because it's hard to be an academic superintendent in very political towns. And DC, how much more of it's the nation's capital.
Right.
How much more political can it get?
It literally is a microcosm of the country. Aside from low income white people, we don't have that.
So there's two other things I wanted to get to. One, we'll just start here. You're on the charter school board in DC. Tell me about your unique as a official in DC that is over charter schools. Tell me what's the unique political view that you have.
So there are several things that, and I always think about my work as being the authorizer, and the work that we do is to make sure that there are standards set for these schools to meet. And so we review applications to open them, review schools every 5 years to see if they will continue their charter. And if they are not meeting the goals that they set, that we are able to close those schools. And so one of the talking points you'll hear nationally will be, oh, these number of charter schools closed. Well, yes, because they were not performing. And so in thinking about my role as a board member, my role is to, review and to think about when new applications come in, does this make sense? Is there a need? And will this school be able to continue for the duration of its charter? And then there's the idea of when schools are operating and they're doing well, what works, right? What is working well that can be shared across not only the charter sector, but across the entire education ecosystem, not only here, but in other places. And then when schools are not performing to task, what do we need to do to, one, make sure that parents, families, and students know what their options are in terms of returning to either the traditional public school system or going into another charter school, another public charter school. And then, once that decision has been made, unrolling that deck the way that it needs to make sure that that all the pieces fall where they may for the adults.
Okay. So what's the unique perspective, though, as a charter leader? I feel like that was a political answer.
Well, I guess for me, it's the thing of, one of the things that I'm focused on is community engagement and thinking about how do we bring the voices of the folks who don't necessarily have, who feel like they haven't had a say in what happens, but they voted with their feet to leave the traditional system. How are we uplifting their voices and being thoughtful about them when we're making decisions about schools? In terms of my political standpoint, right now, I want the sector to continue to do its work. I think there is a balance to being able to have competition. We have seen DC public schools really and truly improve the way that they operate because there has been some competition. So for me, that is, and I hate that because it's like one of the talking points that people use as a problematic issue within the charter space. But my thing is making sure that the schools work so that kids come out of school able to do what it is that they want to do.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that the charter sector in DC does enough to make sure that there's indigenous representation within its ranks, meaning people who are homegrown, people who, have been raised in
In terms of our charter leaders or school leaders?
Charter leaders, so when you think about a charter sector, there's a lot of actors and players involved in that. So if I were to come to DC and I were to put all the actors and the charter land into a room and have them all just lined up and say, let's have a conversation about Black students, who would I be looking at in that room?
You'd be looking at, again, a microcosm of America, but we do have a very strong Black voice because we have so many Black and brown school leaders and founders, people that were early adopters to the charter. My air conditioner is loud, to the charter space. And so those folks being very vocal, but also being the thought leaders that help to create the ecosystem that we have now.
So you have Black leaders and founders and ones who are early adopters. And I think I can think of a few charter schools that have that national rep, like from you guys there locally. I'm still trying to peel back a bit more into the curtain, behind the curtain of if I were to line up all the actors and players who make charter schools work in DC in general, is that a pretty representative of locals, like people in DC? I actually think Indigenous is an important measure in any market, right? Like, so in the Twin Cities and Minneapolis, for sure, I can say without a doubt that many of the charter community is very Indigenous to the area.
I would say the charter community, but in terms of who has more, so there are a lot of folks that are here who are Indigenous, but are not Black or brown, right? People who have done the work of knowing and understanding DC because they've lived in this space and were raised here. I know some outstanding school leaders and founders and people that are committed to the work and to Black and brown children, but they are not Black themselves. And I think that's different than people that come into the space and, think about their growth plans and all of that.
Like total carpetbaggers, like people who come from other parts of the country and say, hey, this is a good place
to lay down the stake. Right. Yeah. So I would say it is a good representation. Could it be better? Absolutely. I think I've mentioned this before that last year, the charter board approved 5 applications. 4 of them were schools founded by Black people. Some of them former teachers in other charters or from the traditional sector. So it's a mixed bag. I mean, our funding, our funder side of that work is predominantly white. But how is that different than in other places? So it's right. So it's the people that are going to show up in the rooms are going to be, it's going to be a very diverse room. I'll put it that way. You have your Sean Hartnetts, you have, and I only thought about Sean because I just saw him on a panel. But we have a good, if not homegrown and Indigenous, but a solid group of Black people that are committed to education here. Could it be more? Yes. But like the DC Public Charter School Board, a good number of us are Black. We have, like I said at the top, we have 2 Black women that are leading 2 of the institutions related to charter schools here. So I think it's a good representation, but it could be better.
Along those lines, getting back to what we said earlier about the fact that DC has a larger number of Black people with something in life. It's actually like a beacon of Black economics in some ways, right? And I always say that as a person who visits, but then visits a lot of other places in the country.
That's right.
Right.
That's right.
So if you live there and you stay there and you don't travel much, you may be used to seeing this kind of class stratification of Black folks, but I think it's different in DC than elsewhere. So when you just said the majority of the people investing in charter schools are white, and a lot of the money comes from philanthropists who are white who want to see a difference in education, and they feel like that's the lever to pull for making societal change. Why is it that you think that with so many Black wealthy or Black people of means, that there isn't more Black investment in alternative schools, charter schools?
I think the rhetoric is deep in terms of people's anti-charter leanings. And I also think that Black folks with money,
keep going.
Oh, Chris!
I love a conversation that starts with Black people with money.
Because I've had this conversation about, like, if you look at the national space, Oprah and other folks with money don't really lean into education because
Oprah
it is
started a school in Africa.
Right, in Africa. She didn't start one here.
She didn't start one in Chicago, where she's from.
She's not from Chicago, though, is she?
Well, I mean, okay. So
but I know where she where
She earned her keep in
planted
Chicago.
herself, right?
Yeah.
Because I mean,
Where
people can
Harpo Studios is within blocks of kids that could use investment.
That's right.
Yeah.
Because I think it is such a contentious space. And I think people are like, my thing is you have to fight every day. What did Oprah say in Color Purple? What was her line about? Every day I have to fight. I got to fight all these people. I'm not getting ready. I don't want to do
All
that.
my life
I had to fight. And like, why would you want to put up that type of fight? Just like when what's his name? LeBron James opened his school. They were very deliberate about saying, oh, but it's not a charter. You wouldn't do that unless you know that there are people that are going to come for you because of that label.
What I thought was so hilarious about that one, though, is it was totally a charter school.
Because it's a charter school, right?
It's totally a charter
it's
school
like
without the name. So I was happy about it.
Right.
I was happy because he's given a path to other Black people with money to be able to do something without the charter label.
But doing it without the charter label, but then that leaves the Black people who are under that label.
That's true.
It leaves them out to dry.
Yeah.
The Black and brown people that are doing that, and how they have to they are fighting for their recognition in terms of we've been doing this work as well, but you're attributing some of the bad actors, the folks that are doing really foolish things. And I've seen Black leaders that have done really foolish things, specifically here in DC. And it's not helpful. But I think the reason that a lot of why Robert Smith is not giving money to the K-12 space versus what he's doing in terms of helping in the higher ed space and that economic curve, all of the craziness that's happening there. I think that's why people don't want to have those debates, because they do believe in a lot of folks specifically in the middle of the country really do believe in charter. In public school and what that means. I know when I left DC and went to college in Mississippi, me even saying that I went to a private high school, they called me an elitist. And I'm like, but wait, that's not how I understood it. That's not how it was framed in DC versus in Mississippi, in Jackson. Those segregationist schools were created, those private schools were created so that white kids for white flight. Versus New Orleans, where in New Orleans, a good majority of middle class and upper middle class Black people send their kids to private school. And
to Catholic school.
Right.
Just
to
like
Catholic
it's
school.
Yep.
Yeah. I'm not Catholic. And I think I said this recently. I'm not Catholic, was never raised Catholic. And my mother certainly selected a Catholic school for me to attend. But I think it's the fight.
Black and brown families, Catholic schools. Definitely for Latino families, Catholic schools have been an option. Working class folks.
Yep.
I have a provocative thought. I know we're coming to an end, but provocative thought to drop a bomb, as I always do towards the ends of the show. So, this has come up in the 8 Black Hands podcast that we have talked about this class issue. I think that you have a lot of people that are disgruntled within the ed reform space, the so-called ed reform space, the space of philanthropy and school startups and advocacy and policy. A recurring theme is this kind of disgruntled nature of people of color within that field or a sector, or whatever you want to call it, that they have grievances with white philanthropists who are funding them. They have grievances with white philanthropists that have passed over them for a grant here or there. And they have criticisms and critique for the field itself, for the sector. And none of this has to do with the mission. The mission is to create new options and opportunities, but you lose that mission once you work in it long enough and you've been getting paid in it long enough, and then you're not getting what you want. You start acting like a union member, like school reform need a union so that they can have all these grievances and negotiate and bargain. Right. I don't mean to make light of it, but I do want to say that I think underneath the biggest frustration is that they have to ask white people for money in the first place, not because that in itself is the problem, but I think because they don't have an alternative, which is Black people with money investing. And if they did their work, and if they could sell Black people with money and with something on it, they would be less frustrated, but that would take more work.
That takes more work, right?
More work.
Yep. And I feel like we had this conversation about 3 years ago about what does it mean? I had hosted it or produced an event with UNCF, Building Better Narratives in Black Education. And Mark Morial and Dr. Michael Lomax had a conversation, and Dr. Lomax was very deliberate about talking about that issue of Black organizations and Black people having to kind of acquiesce to the desires of white funders and then still getting crumbs. And that being that idea of how do you sell Black people, like how is it possible to have the conversation around what does it mean to invest in K-12 education? That it's just so much, it's such a harder conversation to have.
Yeah, it seems like a bigger part of our work, though, is to sell our own people on the idea that you don't have much to complain about if you're not doing the work of getting your own people on board.
That's right. That's right.
We have a lot of cushy job people who would, damn near tell you that they're enslaved by the sector in some way, shape, or form. And they'll tell you this over a fancy meal in a hotel somewhere,
right?
About how white folks ain't doing this and that and further. Again, I don't mean to make light of that, but we have Black people working in those philanthropies. We have our own philanthropies. We have Black philanthropies. We have, you mentioned UNCF, which is, I can't even tell you the budget size. It's the largest education organization for people of color in the world, right?
That's right.
Broke, right? You have the National Urban League, the NAACP, the sororities, fraternities, Jack and Jill.
But then when you say, when you think about UNCF not being broke, but that money has to be redistributed, right? It's not like that is money that is circulating in a way where it always comes back to that central location, because then
a lot of it's earmarked for something specific, right?
Right.
But I'm trying to make the case for the thing that when you talk about Black economics, period, just overall, the thing that comes up all the time is if we were our own country, this is what our GDP would be, right? Which is a different way of looking at us. We're not beggars. We're not broke. We're not beggars. We're not without our own resources. We're without connection.
Right.
We're without a plan.
Right. That networking plan. And that goes back to the point I was making earlier. And yes, Ms. Johnson, charter schools are public schools. Definitely. That is something I say, I have to say on a regular basis here in DC. But the idea of like again, CBC, the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation's annual legislative conference, being a space and opportunity for a lot of that conversation to happen, and it doesn't. And how do we create the opportunity to do that?
Well, I mean, they're funded oftentimes by the teachers unions, as are many Black organizations. So with all the griping we can do about Black advocacy space and ed reform or whatnot being funded by so-called billionaires, the same people who have that energy for at this advocacy space, even when they're being paid by it, don't have that same energy for the other one. That they know that the system's public employees are collecting their money together to have political power to override the will.
People don't even make those connections.
They don't. Well, anyways, we are coming to the end here.
It's always a pleasure.
It's always a pleasure talking to you. You're my sister, and we are definitely walking this path together. You're like one of my favorite people to talk to about these issues privately, because I feel like when we talk, you're my biggest check on keeping it real. You don't say stuff like, Chris, if you said things nicer, more people would hear you. You don't say, well, Chris, I'm going to need you not to say that in public.
No, there are things that need to be said.
There are things that need to be said. And there's a new generation of leadership that comes up behind us that we need to be honest for. We need to say the things so that new generation is actually, they start out being honest from the get-go.
That's right.
So I appreciate you.
Appreciate you, brother.
For everybody who is watching, who has watched this show, Naomi's Twitter handle has been going across the bottom. So that's how you can find her. It's just at Naomi Shelton, DC. Look at that. She put the DC right in the
all
name.
Platforms. Because there's a gospel singer with my name, and I had to differentiate.
Well, I mean, you should not differentiate. You should just live on some of that steam.
Naomi Shelton and the Gospel Queens. Right. Yeah, sure.
So as always, I thank you all for watching this broadcast. It's very important to me that we do whatever we can during this time of COVID, where we're locked in, to still have a voice, still have the conversation go. This isn't my having a show. This is a dialogue. This is like having a place in a space to be able to hear from folks. I don't care whether we agree or disagree or whatnot. We have to keep the dialogue going. And we are being left behind in some pretty significant ways, especially now with COVID, that we better be working together, connecting, talking about things, sharing resources, and eventually, I hope, having a plan and an agenda so
That's
that we
right.
don't have to keep talking about the same stuff
That's
over
right.
and over again. Thank you, Naomi.